All right. Welcome, everyone, to the last episode of the year for the Healthcare AI podcast. Alex, good to see you
Hey,
again. How
yeah,
you been?
I've been doing pretty well. We're working on stuff relevant to today's podcast, but
And
hopefully
and,
in the
and
new year we can, get some more stuff. Maybe you get some more regular episodes out there.
yeah, for those of you who are like joining in for the first time, welcome. Glad to have you here. This is a podcast about AI and specifically AI related to healthcare topics that we've been doing for a while. And yeah, Alex and I have been at it for a while,
Yeah.
and we've worked together for a long time in the AI space now. Hey, Alex, so welcome back to Washington State. I know you were like,
Yes. Yeah.
Florida. So is this the first episode we're doing after you moved back to Washington?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Um,
So
Glad to be
you
away
brought
from
the
the
rain.
humidity.
How's the rain and all the atmospheric river stuff going on? So yeah, it's great timing.
I mean, it was like the Pure Rise in Florida was like a really rainy. Like last year was like really rainy, and then came here. It's really rainy.
Hmm.
Obviously, like I'm born and raised in Washington, so I'm used to the rain. Yeah, so just rain, 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 rain. Um,
All right. So, speaking of yeah, so what are we going to be talking about this week, Alex?
yeah, so the topic I was thinking about was guardrails in the healthcare space. Obviously, actually let's just define guardrails for everyone. So the idea is you build your LLM based application, and you want to make sure that the responses you are generating or the inputs you're receiving, you want to make sure that they're safe. And there's many different risks that's possible there. Of course, perhaps like the most generally known is jailbreaking. So someone puts in something in their prompt in order to get your system to behave in some way to embarrass you or to take advantage of your offering. Like I think there's stories of people using chatbots out there to get like free access to LLMs by jailbreaking them.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and then of course
Yeah,
there's like
and
worse. Yeah,
and then in terms of like how it applies to the medical domain, what would the scenario be like? What obviously there's a lot of safety concerns in this domain, but specifically, what are some of the concerns that you think where something like
yeah.
this would be very important? So.
And there's of course like the risk of people going there to do like specific things like stealing data, trying to get data out. But I think the more common concern is there's these certain weaknesses to LLMs that in a clinical context, in a medical context, are extremely dangerous. So sycophancy, you let's say if you're not in a medical context, you go and say, oh, I have this idea for a recipe, and the LLM says, "Oh, it's a great idea." Then you cook it, and it's terrible. That's bad. But in the medical context, someone goes on and says, like, "Oh, I want to change how I'm taking my medication. I want to take an extra dosage because I'm feeling particularly bad." It's sycophancy. If it leads it to the model agreeing with you, that could risk your life. And there are already some stories out there of people, getting advice from LLMs and it leading to very bad outcomes.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen the news articles and even studies that say like, hey, people are using a lot of people are using chatbots for asking for medical advice when there's and these makers are explicitly saying, hey, you should not be using these for medical advice. People, obviously, in lack of other expert advice or access to advice or help, are turning to these free chatbots, right? Which,
Yeah,
as you said, they could be sycophantic, they could hallucinate, they could have all kinds of issues, which they're not really built for the right guardrails were not put in place for them to operate within this sort of medical domain,
yeah,
and so obviously that's a huge challenge. And but what are the other stakes? Like, yeah, let's sort of dive into that. Like, what are the stakes, and why do you think this sort of matters at this moment in time, where people are starting, as we said, people are starting to use this more, even against the advice of these LLM makers. What are some of the challenges if they continue doing so without the right guardrails and things in place? So.
yeah. I think right now there's a crazy amount of like market pressure that's going to lead people to using it, either using generic LLMs for advice, or even for different providers or different like healthcare companies to make these LLM chatbots available. And there's this big pressure to have that there. But then there's these dangers, and mental health is like another big concern, where like people ask mental health questions, and the peculiarities of the LLM can lead to very bad outcomes. And
Mm-hmm.
we have all these different concerns, and if you look at what's out there for guardrails, there are some off-the-shelf solutions, but they're built for very generic data, and
Mm-hmm.
that's like twofold problems. One is those are generally not built for handling some of the technical things like medication, but also sometimes they can be overly sensitive. So, for example, if let's say you're building a chatbot where a person's supposed to, I don't know whether they should be concerned about a particular symptom, but if they have something in a sensitive area, like in their like on their genitalia, a generic a guardrail will probably flag that as not safe for work and be like, oh no, that's bad. But in a physical setting, that's an acceptable thing to talk about. If you wanted to like block, let's say, toxic behavior from your users, that may not be something you want to do in a medical setting, because when people are under duress, they can behave in ways that are fairly unacceptable. But as a provider, you may actually want to capture that information. Say like, oh, my patient who's perhaps dealing with like pain symptoms, if they're responding extremely angrily right now to the chatbot, that may be a sign that the therapy is not working for them.
Right, right. And where is the regulation in all of this, right? We're talking about, obviously, healthcare is a regulated domain. There's
Yeah,
so many regulatory bodies that ensure that anything that is considered therapy or some sort of drug, or, is clearly regulated. So where does this fit in, and what are the regulatory bodies? What are they doing about this?
so both in the United States and in Europe, they are developing these things. There already is some like regulation in place, or at least guidance and regulation. But as the government gets more interested in regulating AI, as we're seeing globally, there's an increased interest in doing that. I think every organization who's working in healthcare with AI, they need to do everything they can to be ahead of the curve, because you don't
Mhm.
want to have like some new regulation come in and now, oh, you have to pause this product, you have to pause your services until you get everything sorted out.
Right. It's what I call the GDPR effect, right? Like, so for those of you who don't remember, GDPR is the data privacy regulation that the EU passed, and a lot of the US companies were sort of caught off guard when that actually passed, and they had to quickly sort of react and really scramble to see how they can be compliant with this, because they were doing business in Europe, right? And if you're dealing with any kind of EU citizen data, you would have to be compliant with GDPR, or you cannot do business there. And so you might think, oh, well, European regulations don't apply to American companies, but oftentimes they do, because these American companies are also doing business in Europe as well. And so that's another reason why, yeah, to your point, it's a good idea to sort of be ahead of the curve when it comes to these regulations. And typically, US has been slow to move when it comes to sort of technical regulations in the technology landscape,
Yeah.
and Europe has been, yeah, also historically faster to move around these topics. So yeah, I would definitely watch out where the Europeans are doing, and try to at least stay at par with what they're actually doing here. So that makes
And just like
sense.
we're seeing in the United States, how like from like one administration to another, you can see drastic shifts in AI policy. And someone's say, "Oh, I operate in America. There's not much regulation here." But the next administration can come in, and then towards what you're saying, they can be like, "Oh, let's just like adopt whatever like Europe saying." Because, for example, California, previously for privacy, they basically adopted a very similar
That's
thing
right.
to GDPR.
That's right. That's
Um,
right. I remember that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. 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 Some of the states, yeah, they end up, because the U.S. Federal government is
yeah.
the one that I meant was pretty slow to move, but some of the states, they've been sort of trying to move faster and try to be closer to what Europe has been doing when it comes to privacy and security and things like that. So yeah. So let's dive into this a little bit more, right? So okay, so we've clearly, you've talked about this problem and this sort of, shift in the paradigm where, like, people are turning to some of these chatbots and LLMs for medical advice and other things, and they're being used more even within the medical industry itself. And we talked about regulation is also sort of another factor that's pressing on this. So what is the solution? So space look like? So what would be a good sort of guardrail framework what should it consist of? What are the, how can we think about this?
So I think right now that the two most popular sort of frameworks for working with guardrails is one, Guardrails AI, and that has I think a pretty like simple, easy to understand framework. It's a pretty simple and easy to understand framework. Essentially, you can like run a guardrail server, which is how they advise you do it in production, and then you support various models that will give you evaluations for different risks. And the idea is like you then add into your code places where you want to check
Mhm.
either user inputs or system outputs. And the other one is like NeMo guardrails. So that's, I believe, from a project started by
Yeah.
NVIDIA.
Yeah.
And they have like a special LLM and a special
Sure.
domain specific language for describing your system. And then that helps them figure out like where to
Yeah.
like
And
to check.
how do these operate? Like, because we're like, yeah, there's this document level uncertainty or mismatch, or like what, maybe we can talk about like how some of these guardrail systems actually operate, and what are
Yeah.
the different sort of principles that they operate on. Yeah.
So yeah, so as like preparation for this podcast, there's a paper we have in there where they were trying to analyze guardrails in a specific medical domain, and that's what we're talking about, the document level stuff, where they're trying to like identify like appropriate documents. So, for example, if you're having like a more informational type chatbot, or translational, as in this case is in their topic, you're going to be retrieving reference documents, sort of a rag like thing, and you do want to make sure that you're retrieving the right documents, so that your system's not like pulling some random untrustworthy blog or something that's completely irrelevant. And then they talk about like hard and soft guardrails as well,
Mm.
and that's what came up recently in a project where there were certain rules they had where if a guardrail was tripped, they would want a like specific response to be given. So, for example, if you ask for advice on medication, they absolutely do not want the LLM generating any advice on medication. Um,
Mm.
and so they want
And
it to
this
be
is to avoid hallucination and all these
exactly,
other problems that might cause. Okay,
yeah.
that makes sense
And
to
then
me. Yeah.
there's I think lots of reasons because like it's doctors will sometimes use medication for off-label purposes as well, or they will tailor dosages based off of other things in the medical record. Basically, the way the doctors and the pharmacists instruct our medication can be so sensitive to the individual situation. It's unrealistic to think the LLM could give reasonable advice. It's like it's so specific. Unless I guess you could potentially like train a specific like medicine advice, but yeah. So they don't want it giving any sort of advice at all, other than just say talk to your doctor and pharmacist.
Mm.
Um, and so those would be like hard rules, like, oh, did the person ask for this advice? In which case, okay, that's it. Stop generation, give the response.
Mm. Mm.
But you have other ones that are a lot more sort of murky. So this goes into like the issue of one of the guardrails you have out there, we have that's pretty common, is looking for demographic bias. And for some demographic bias, it's it sort of works in the general case like racial bias. You don't want there's not too many situations where you want a difference in behavior depending on the race of the patient. There maybe are some situations, but you have a lot of these models that are also trained to filter out ableism, right? So they'll say like, oh, this output is talking about being in a wheelchair, and that's potentially ableist. Well, that's
Mm.
also highly medically relevant. Um,
Right. Right.
so this goes more towards like you need both a domain specific model, but then you also need to, as for your guardrails, let alone obviously for your application, you need domain specific model, but you also need to make sure that you can control exactly like how it's testing and how it's responding to these risks when you come across them. Yeah.
Okay. And okay, and that's a good, I guess, way to think about how to go about solving this problem. And I do realize that a lot of people, at least in the industry, we're seeing that people are starting to fine tune the some of the specialized safety LLMs. around to solve this sort of guardrail problem. And yeah, let's maybe dig into that and seeing what have people been doing, what are the different models they've been using, how are they using it. Maybe we can just get into that a little bit to understand. Like, I mean, it's fighting fire. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of fighting fire with fire, right? Like
Yeah.
you have a problem that the LLMs have created, and you're resorting to LLMs to sort of solve it. And maybe a more specialized one that's, sort of watching the watchers, so to speak. So yeah, let's get into that. Like, so what are the different ways that people are doing like specialized safety LLMs?
Yeah, and I think this probably deserves like a similar comment to like in the previous episode where we talked about LLMs as a judge,
Hmm.
where like it does seem like on the surface like, oh well, how can an LLM be the solution to this if they're the cause? But if you think about this task of, is there something problematic in the input or output, is a much simpler task than what an overall like a chatbot application is doing. So
Hmm.
although it seems like, oh well, why would the LLM be able to solve this if it's causing this problem? It's because it's a lot easier to just determine whether something has a particular problem, than to prevent that problem from ever occurring. In the larger application. So as I mentioned before, we have NeMo, and NeMo uses I believe their own fine-tuned version of Llama Guard, which is a llama
Hmm.
model that was fine-tuned for no, it's not Llama Guard. It's I forget the name of the model. I think that's the Lynx model. If I remember right. But yeah, it's similar to one that Llama released, which is it's a small llama model. They have different sizes available, and essentially what it does is that you give it some content and it returns either like, oh, it's safe, or it says it's unsafe, and it has different classifications for like what are the different types of rules that might be breaking this content you're giving it. Another one from OpenAI is one of their open source models, GPT OSS. What was the full name?
Safeguard, yeah.
Safeguard. There we go. That's another one, and that one allows you to provide a system prompt with your particular policies. And your policies are
Hmm.
basically like a document that like gives definitions, give rules, etc. I think we're probably going to see a lot more options like this go forward. Right now, I
Hmm.
mentioned for Guardrails AI, a lot of their models are either rule based or like deep learning, like BERT based models. They do
Hmm.
have some LLM ones as well, even though they're not built towards a specific LLM. That you pick the LLM that they contact. Um,
Yeah. What do
I
you?
think
I'm curious. What are you guys doing? I know you work for Pacific AI, and like, aren't you guys doing something in this space as well?
yeah, so we recently worked with someone. They're using Guardrails AI, and yeah, it's the stuff that's also from Guardrails AI is like a good starting thing, especially if you're doing something generic. Um,
Hmm.
it's not great in the domain specific stuff. We are building our own suite of uh, medical models, um,
Mm.
and so we're specifically Pacific AI. We're doing a lot of experimentation around finding these problems in LLM outputs. As a matter of fact, like, one of the things I work on specifically is red teaming testing, which is like
Mm.
I'm specifically trying to like poke the models to get them to do the bad thing. Um,
Right.
and it's right now sort of where we are, and I think it's
By the way,
good if
that is a it's been a common practice in the security space, the cybersecurity space, red teaming. And I don't think people know this word in the sort of larger software engineering domain, and or definitely not in the AI space. So yeah, I think it's definitely getting popularity as a practice,
yeah.
as as we're starting to see. So I'm glad you guys are doing that. And so what were some? I don't know if you want to share some like experiences or like sort of gotchas that you guys found while doing the red teaming for this sort of guardrails exercise. If there's anything,
Well,
yeah.
I think the first thing I would mention is just like how absolutely at the edge like a lot of the stuff is. Like you said, like it's very new.
Mm.
There's not like a data set you can just go out there like, oh, here's a data set and that's good enough. A lot of the data sets for testing LLMs out there are repurposed data sets from previous, more classic NLP things. Multiple choice is really common. It's just, multiple choice questions. And then there's a lot of synthetic data. So a lot of the data sets that are already out there are not really great. Um,
Mm,
we're researching now about like how we could potentially use LLMs to like grow a question set, um,
mm-hmm.
as well as
So,
Lang Test, which is another project from JSL, which can create perturbations in data. So basically, you give it a
right,
question and you say like, okay, switch out the diseases, switch out demographic information, which is again an
right.
important test.
So it almost sounds like you guys are building like a golden data set for this domain and this problem area. And do you guys use a lot of human in the loop type stuff to sort of evaluate this, or like
You
how's that going?
absolutely have to at this early stage. There's no way of getting, because it, if you have like an established set of data, you can do a lot of like automatic growing of it because you have other data to compare it to, right?
Hmm.
Let's say I have some sort of like classic regression problem, and I try and grow it artificially. I can test to see if my data belongs in the distribution of what I'm testing. I don't need human in the loop. I need some simple statistics. If you're growing data, especially data that's more chatbot like as opposed to multiple choice, so like a
Hmm.
more realistic and robust scenario, there's only one way to actually establish what you're doing is valid, and that's an expert. Um,
Hmm.
so for this early stage, experts are absolutely needed. But also, as the paper itself talks about, the one I linked about the guardrails in healthcare, that's for the long term, that's not feasible. Um,
Hmm.
Granted, they did all their stuff with expert ratings as well, all their judgments of how the guardrails worked. Um, they use expert judgments as well, but that's good for like beginning to build out a data set. But if you can't run guardrails with a human in the loop, right? You can't have like a team of people
Right.
there looking at your answers.
Well, you
Um,
could. It'd just be very expensive and very slow.
yes. um,
Yeah.
so
Um, I
and
know.
then
So for those of you who are old enough to remember this, there was one. Google might still do this, but they had the April Fools, thing on their homepage every 1st of April. What one of those times they actually had a thing about how their algorithm works. So for the as we all know, Google uses PageRank, and I think one of the April Fools they were like, "Hey, we're switching to this new algorithm we call it Pigeon Rank, and we have a bunch of pigeons. They're they're going to decide and rank which results to show you they're all pecking at the thing." And yeah, so it'll be something like that. If you have a bunch of humans sort of look at every single result during it first time and then decide if it should be flagged or not. But speaking of which, I know the paper talks about this where they have a distribution of common errors and accuracy and things like that. In your experience working with this data set with this customer, that does that jive with like what you're seeing, or like are you seeing a different class of errors when you were doing this?
so essentially what I found is that because there's another trend going on with these LLM applications, which is um, the big concern is of course the variance in these models, which leads both to lots of like, good innovative answers but also hallucinations and negative answers. And there's essentially one main way that's controlled. You constrain your system. You constrain the types of inputs you allow from users, or you constrain the types of answers it gives. And the thing is, as you do that, your system then becomes more unique. So what I observed from like some of our recent work is that there is a need for general purpose like medical chatbot testing, so that you can say, hey, I crossed my i's and dotted my t's. But there's also a need for the be able to develop application specific testing, and that's one of the things that I think is my big takeaway. It's like there's situations where for a customer's given product, they need
Mm,
to develop a test for that, because there can be
right.
potentially very negative outcomes. But also, it's not a thing that would come up in a generic product. It's like it's specific to how their product is architected or how their UX is built. Um, so
Right. And
for anyone
so
out
this
there,
is the levels of testing. So, hey, there's the model level testing, there's the system level testing, and then there's the
yes,
application, which includes the user experience and all of the other stuff, the end user experience level testing.
yeah,
And each of them would sort of potentially introduce their own class of errors or compound some of the errors
yeah.
in the lower levels, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
like
that
for
makes
example,
sense.
part of the things in the EU AI Act, one of the rules is that your AI cannot pretend to be human, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these like really bad stories of like someone being manipulated into harming themselves by an AI, a lot of that has to do with the AI essentially pretending to be a person, even if not human, to the person that's being manipulated. And what that means, like if you're building an experience where you want to have like a more personable style from your AI, a UX requirement then would be like, oh, I want this personal style, but also I need to make sure that it's not pretending to be a person. I need to make sure that it's clear every step of the way. It's just a chatbot. Um,
Mm-hmm.
which outside of the medical domain, you're seeing a lot of companies not doing that at all. You end up like talking with someone, talking with not with someone, but like on some website, and you're like, I'm not sure is this an AI or person. Eventually, you can suss out which way it is, but yeah, they need to develop this. They need to develop these tests for their own like specific things of their product, because all the regulation is going to go the way of like, oh, you need to do standard tests, you need to do stuff like that. We still will have a situation where like what your chatbot does will be something your organization will be accountable for. So even if like, oh well, there's the standard test didn't cover this, we didn't know. Well, too bad. You caused the negative outcome. You have to deal with it. You have to pay for it. I think that what people who are building stuff in healthcare right now, what they should do is that they need to both monitor like regulation news, but I
Mm-hmm.
think just as importantly, they need to monitor like research on testing AI in healthcare,
Right.
because that's how you stay ahead of the curve. If you see how that's going, and you make sure your organization has a test first mindset.
Right. I got a simpler way. Maybe they could just hire you and just have you do all that. I don't know about you. I can't seem to keep up with the research that's happening in this space. I don't think anybody can
Yeah.
anymore. But yeah, it's just moving at such a fast pace that it's even researchers whose job it is to track this stuff, they're having a hard time to keep track of all this stuff that's happening. And
Yeah.
partly because maybe a lot of it is also AI is adding to it, right? Like with AI,
Yes.
and like everyone's publishing more AI slop out there, so it's becoming harder and harder to tell the difference.
But this is why, and it's something like even like before this current thing, I always encourage people like when you're building something, you know, anything that's using AI or machine learning or data at all, you need to come in opinionated on what is correct for your system. You need to know how to test your system. There's never going to be some magical testing panacea out there, and don't even look for that. Come into when you read research or when you look at a data set, when you look at a testing suite, come into it and saying, I know what I need to do to test my system. Now take feedback because you're probably missing things, but you do need, everyone needs to understand that like in order to test well, you have to know your system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But by the way, this reminds me, like we're working in Qualtrics. We just passed this compliance with ISO 42001, and it's about responsible AI and how we make sure that when we're building AI features, you start to think about some of these things well before it actually is required. And this is, I think, part of the problem that you're sort of raising is most people think of like, oh, am I doing the right thing around safety and responsible AI and guardrails and things like that? It's always been an afterthought, right?
Mhm.
And I think the industry needs to wake up and like this. And I think we were talking about before the show is like, hey, there used to be a moment like this, even cybersecurity, where security was always an afterthought. You build the thing, and then you're like, okay, oh, now I'm being asked to secure it because my CISO was yelling at me, whatever. And then I put in a bunch of like guardrails, for lack of a better word, like I put a firewall or whatever, and then tried, oh, I'm secure now, let's ship it. And I feel like that's the moment we're in right now when it comes to these mission critical, safety critical systems that we're starting to build with LLMs and Gen AI. Is it, people are acknowledging grudgingly that yes, yes, we got to do this, but it's always an afterthought,
Yeah.
right? And so the paradigm shift that the industry needs to, I feel like, needs to wake up to is that we've got to start shifting left. Similar to what happened with cybersecurity is they actually had this concept of shift left, right? Which means hey, it's not enough. There's a bunch of security guys at the end, the lag end of the development cycle, sort of have a security review and point out a bunch of flaws in your system. That's almost too late and too expensive. As we all know, any bug that's found, the later it's found, the more expensive it is to fix this, right? And so think of these are actually bugs that you've already introduced into your system. So the sooner we can think about these things, and the sooner we can plan for this and design for this, the less expensive it's going to be, the more well thought out it's going to be, and the more streamlined it's going to be when the system actually comes out, and and people are starting to use this. And so this whole shift left paradigm, I think, needs to happen around safety and responsible AI and in general for these mission critical applications and domains. So yeah, things like MRM cards, and look into ISO 4201, and look into all these like other regulatory things that we'll put in the show notes, and see how you can start designing or thinking about these systems almost at product conception time,
Yes.
right? Because as if you're not, you're probably, it's going to be a bit too late, and then you're going to do some sort of last minute hack job, and then it probably won't be enough. And and unfortunately, you're if you're working in a medical domain, it might be the difference between life and death
Yeah.
in some cases. So yeah.
And not to pick out people who do vibe coding, but like there's plenty of situations out there where we've heard people where they implemented AI in their system, and they use it broadly, and they use it everywhere, and they use it uncarefully. And you have these stories like their AI dumped their database, or or had some sort of like terrible effect. People need to develop carefully. Like you mentioned with security, there's no reason why your AI should be able to have broad access to your system, especially when you're dealing with sensitive data. If you're unless your AI can take HIPAA training, it should not have access to your system. And no, your AI cannot take HIPAA training. Just to be clear. um, I think now, like they talk about these hype cycles with technology. I think we're at the point now where I think the people who want to be more future proof, they need to put themselves in the mindset of after the hype cycle. Like you have to tell,
Right.
oh, AI is like this thing, it has this dangerous, and you don't want to be excited about it. Be excited about it in actuality, but when you're building your software, be very sober about how you work with it. Especially because there are all these like cool emergent capabilities that are allowing all these cool new things. Each one of those things can potentially lead to a new danger. And so like one like call back to like a really really old thing in AI that predates me as a person, the ELIZA effect.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I understand that your users, even if you put like a big flashing warning, this is a chatbot, because the LLMs respond with such fluent language, there will be a projection of personhood on it.
Yes.
And so
Yeah, and I think that's also very human, right? We look at a dot with two dots and a circle, and like, oh, that's his face, and we tend to do that
yeah,
even if it didn't speak to us. So yeah, I think it's just a psychological need for us to.
yeah, and like, a lot of people who design these systems and work on them, they're very tech savvy, very they're very aware of it. But if you're building a medical chatbot, it's primarily, and I say like probably the largest demographic that'll be interacting with it could be elderly people, and they may not even be able to tell that this is not a person they're communicating with, because
Oh
they're
yeah,
not tech.
I think it's not just the elderly people.
Yeah,
We can't, like, even regular people can't tell the difference anymore,
yeah,
and yeah, it's getting harder and harder to detect a lot of the stuff that these images and videos we're starting to see as well. And so as a reality is definitely broken right now. So we need a way to sort of, and that's why I'm looking at these guardrails and these kinds of technologies are so important, because that is the way we can sort of keep ourselves in check and make sure that
yeah,
we're still grounded to what reality is in some
yeah.
ways. So hey, so what do you think in terms of future work and the current limitations? Where do you think where do you think we're heading? Like, what are, like, where's the industry right now in terms of limitations? You talked about some of this, but maybe you can just go through what the paper talks about, but also some, and we mentioned some of the frameworks and regulatory frameworks. But yeah, where do you, how do you want to, where should we point our listeners to if they want to learn more about this and how to think about this, right? So
So like in the paper they talk about like how they want to like build towards automation, and I think that's where the big research effort is, because you want to be able to actually run these guardrails in a way that's like very that you where you can have confidence that they're looking for the bad things. So
Hmm.
I would say like for people like to get the researchers like look for new data sets being built and look at the leaderboards from them. But again, you know, you probably can't skim like headlines for this. Like you can't just like read the title and skim the abstract. You need to make sure you understand like what the data is actually testing. This is true for any leaderboard, but especially for anything sensitive. You need to know how they're actually testing this. I would say, as far as sort of like where the industry is going overall, I think so. Applications will have their sort of own fine-tuned small language models that they're going to be using for this, because there's sort of two ways you can get it. One is you could take one of these off-the-shelf guardrails models and then you can specialize
Hmm.
it to your data.
Hmm.
Or if you have your own LLM or SLM, you can like distill it into a guardrail SLM that you could then use. So it's two ways to create it. But just like if you were developing software, you wouldn't say like, oh, I'm just going to import this set of unit tests. No, you need to build your own unit tests for security. You're
Right.
not going to be like, or at least not anymore. I'm just going to download this like security testing script and call it a day. No, you need to build it for your application. It's going to be the
Right.
same way with guardrails. You're going to have to build
Yeah.
it for your application.
Right.
So
Sure. That makes sense. Any closing thoughts, Alex, on this topic? Or
I think we're right now at a really nascent stage, because right now, even with the stuff that's currently being researched, it's like at the edge. Most of it is sort of single interaction and not testing like longer
conversational
conversational stuff.
dialogues.
And I
Hmm.
think that that's where like a lot of these negative stories you're seeing, like that's where they're coming from. They're coming from an LLM drifting away from whatever safeguards it was trained with.
Right.
And then as conversation goes on, it can drift away from that behavior that it was
Right.
supposed to
And
do.
then as the context window also gets bigger, there's also a cutoff there that
Yeah.
LLMs, especially if you have like SLMs, which probably tend not to have giant context windows, that could also
Yes.
be a problem. Right. Okay. So yeah, so what we say like in terms of like is there like a general guideline like what can people who are looking to do this responsibly like yeah any sort of parting words of advice?
I would say like, oh, if you're building a healthcare thing now and you're like, oh, I want to put in guardrails, what do I do? I would say, because there's nothing that's like perfect off the shelf. I would say look at how they interact with the system and maybe work with like whoever's architecting your application and figure out which one is best for your development style and your architecture. And understanding, no, the off the shelf isn't good enough, but at least get it implemented in your system, and
Right.
then you can try and fine tune it. Whether that's going for the old fashioned Guardrails AI, fine tuning those is better than nothing. And if you don't have the expertise or the hardware, whatever, for fine tuning your models, building your own custom models for something like Guardrails AI is better than nothing. If you have like the expertise for like fine tuning SLMs and stuff like that, definitely do that. Definitely get something like the GPT OSS safeguard, like fine tune it for your data. Or even if you have a medical specific LLM, maybe just like try and develop some of your own prompts for some of the specific risks in your product. Um,
Right. Right. This goes back to understanding what are the risks for your product
yeah,
and your use case and trying to sort of adapt
yes,
whatever generic framework that you started with to that problem,
yeah.
your problem, right? Yeah.
So I
I
said
think
basically,
that's the hard
right,
work. Yeah.
right now, just make sure you
Mhm.
break ground on doing this with your product, even if you
Right.
don't have perfect, or even like or maybe you don't even have like coverage that even makes you happy. Like, oh, I'm not satisfied with this. At least get something in there, because once you get something in there and you have like some basic ways of measuring how well you're covering these issues, you can always improve that, and you can get that virtuous cycle started. So that's what I encourage. Just get that virtuous cycle started in your product, so you can improve it over time.
It's almost like a muscle. It's a process, right? Just like security and other things. It's more of a journey than a destination.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
It's just getting that process and the muscle of doing this incorporated into your development cycle when it comes to building like Gen AI applications in the medical domain, right? And so just doing that alone is probably has a lot of value.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Well, hey, thanks, Alex. It was great talking to you, and hopefully the listeners have stuck around for this long. Thank you, and and this is like I said, this is going to be our last episode of the year. Hopefully, we'll see you in the new year with a whole bunch of new topics. And look, and I'd love to hear from you guys if you have experience working with LLM guardrails in the medical domain or other domains. Feel free to post a comment. And if there's other new topics that you want us to talk about in the new year, I would love to hear that as well. So, looking forward to more engaging and exciting conversations around this space. As always, Alex, thanks a lot. And yeah, see you in the new year.
So, yeah.